Hey everybody, it's Mr. Matthew here for AP Biology Essential Knowledge Video 2D2. And in this video, we're going to specifically be looking at homeostatic mechanisms, and we're going to look at how those mechanisms may reflect common ancestry and divergence due to adaptations in different environments. We'll also look at the concept of convergence a little bit in the same environment. And so let's break down a little bit of what's in this title. So homeostatic imbalance means we're going to be looking at ways organisms maintain a stable state. And for common ancestry and divergence, well, we know that common ancestry means that they share a recent common ancestor or descended from a now extinct organism that led to modern lineages. And divergence just means that they have drifted apart along different lineages over time. And as a result, even though the mechanisms that we see in the modern organisms may on their surface look a little bit different, if we do a deep analysis, we may actually find that there are conserved underlying structures that lead to those physiological or biochemical differences that we see on the surface. So with that said, here we go. So we're going to start by looking at constructing an explanation based off scientific evidence that homeostatic mechanisms reflect a continuity due to common ancestry and or divergence due to adaptation in different environments. And so one of the broad ways we look at that is we categorize organisms as being either endotherms, meaning organisms that are capable of generating their own internal body heat. We sometimes refer to these as warm-blooded animals. And we contrast that with ectotherms, and ectotherms are animals that are dependent on external sources of body heat. And we look over here at our graph, and what we'll see here is that we've got a little mouse here, and that mouse is representing our endotherm. And what we'll see here is that body temperature is pretty constant in this organism, regardless of what the external temperature says. And we contrast that with this lizard that we see here. And what we find is that as the environmental temperature increases, body temperature increases in a directly proportional manner. And so we see this line. Now, it is important to note that we often think of endotherms as being mammals or birds, but there are some endotherms that don't fit nicely into those categories. And so being an endotherm is a nice big broad category. And sometimes we can say that there's continuity in, say, let's say all mammals, of having that continuity of being an endotherm and having that internal generation of body temperature. But just because two organisms are endothermic, for example, birds and mammals, does not necessarily mean that endothermy comes from a common ancestor. And so this is a good example of this homeostatic mechanism could reflect continuity, or it could be an example of convergent evolution. The fact that we have endotherms in different groups could mean that there are different evolutionary mechanisms that led to endothermic niches being filled by organisms of different evolutionary lineages. Now, I want to shift gears here and take a look at a different example of a mechanism that can be used for homeostasis, and that is this idea of the countercurrent heat exchange system. And so what we'll find here is that as blood flows from the internal portion of a body out to the extremities, we find that the extremities are cooler, but because the heat can go from the artery that is going away and then the blood comes back through the veins, there's a system known as countercurrent heat exchange systems that help trap the heat and reduce heat loss in extremities so that when the blood is coming back into the body, it's getting warmed back up. So while there is a tendency for this blood to cool as it moves outward, this countercurrent heat exchange system helps to reduce the amount of heat loss in those extremities and also ensure that the blood that's flowing back into the core of the body is warm. So now we're looking at some organisms like a Canada goose and a bottlenose dolphin here. And I want you to pause and think on this. Does the fact that animals as diverse as birds and dolphins, as well as ectothermic sharks, fishes, and insects suggest that countercurrent heat exchange is a convergent mechanism or a divergent evolutionary mechanism? I want you to pause and think. All right. So this one was a little mean, and hopefully what you came up with is, I don't know. I need more information. I need to look at the underlying structures and mechanisms in these diverse organisms to answer this question. And the answer is it is a bit of a trick question. On its surface, if your mind went immediately to, well, it appears that this artery and vein blood flow in these two groups, birds and mammals, which I know are both endotherms, but endotherms that are of different lineages, they have this common system. So you might have been trapped into saying, wait, I know that the endothermy in these two groups is convergent, so maybe this countercurrent heat exchange is also a convergent system. But I then threw in all of these other organisms as diverse as sharks and fishes and insects. And so from there, maybe you went, well, if all of these animals have this, maybe this is like some of the enzyme mechanisms we look at, how we have organisms enormously diverse, even beyond the kingdom level, that produce the same enzymes. So even things like yeast and certain animals will produce the same enzyme because those enzymes are from a common ancestor and they had to be conserved because they're so important to survival. So hopefully you were a little bit of two minds and you asked some more questions. And if you did, you didn't fall into my trap for this pause and think. All right, so the last thing I want to look at in this particular idea of homeostatic mechanism and continuity is looking at an example with hippos. And so I don't know if you're aware of this, but when a hippopotamus sweats, it produces a red, oily secretion. And it's actually been described as producing a sunscreen-like effect on hippos. And so we see this hippo sticking its head above the water here, and it's got this pink secretion on it. So here's my question. How could we figure out if the sweat is homologous to human sweat, or maybe a novel evolutionary product that the hippos are producing? Or maybe it's something else entirely. So I want you to think for a minute, and then we're gonna move on. But what kind of things would you want to know in order to help track down if this is homologous to human sweat or if it is something new? Pause and think for a minute. All right. So hopefully what you came up with is you would want to know a little bit more about this hippopotamus sweat and maybe also a little bit more about human sweat. Are there compounds that are in common between these two products? We know that our sweat is predominantly water and salt, but there's a few other things that are in there. Are some of the same compounds found in the hippo sweat? The other thing you might want to know is what structures are producing these oily secretions. Are they like sweat glands? We produce oils in our skins, like sebaceous glands and that sort of thing. So maybe they're not like sweat glands, but maybe they're more like other glands that we produce. So hopefully the questions were about what are in the two secretions that we're looking at, and also what are the structures that are producing them? So those should have been your questions. We're going to continue this theme, and we're going to look now at this cladogram. And so what I want you to do is I want you to analyze this data from a phylogeny and look at the patterns and relationships that show maybe homeostatic mechanisms, and maybe they reflect a continuity due to common ancestry and change due to evolution in different environments. And so what I want to point out here is that down here, we have these group of organisms that have sweat glands. And we say that this grouping up here has no sweat glands and produces oily secretions. And we have our hippo is up here. So what I want you to do is I want you to pause and think and examine this cladogram on the right. Do you think that the hippo sweat is homologous to human sweat given this phylogenetic information? Pause and think. All right, so hopefully what you came up with is, wait a minute, this stuff is coming out is definitely oily and it's red. And we don't think of sweat as being red or oily. And we see that there's oily secretions made by this group of organisms that branched out over here. And so now I got to ask some more questions. The idea that you should have come up with is, I need to know more about the information of this grouping here with the shrews, the moles, the bats, camels, pigs, deer, sheep, horses, rhinos, and that's. I need to know more about the rest of this group. because do they produce sweat or do they produce more oily secretions? If, in fact, they produce an oily secretion, it would suggest that sweat is this novel thing that evolved in this whole group of animals that include humans. But maybe if this group was to produce sweat, then the oily secretions are actually unique to this clade here. All right. So again, it's a little bit of a trick question. It doesn't have a clear answer. You should have answered this pause and think with another series of questions. I need to know more information about the clade that the hippo fits into in order to answer this question. Is it more like this oil group, or is it more like this sweat group? And I need to have some more information. I will say, based off of the compound information that we've been seeing so far and the readings that I've had, it seems that the hippo sweat is a little bit more like an oily secretion similar to that of what you'd find produced by a beaver or other organisms. But maybe you want to go and do a little extra research and find out, is hippo sweat actually sweat, or should we be calling it something else? And that I've been using this misnomer or common language to throw you off the whole time. All right, so the last thing that we're going to do is I want you to look and connect the differences in environment with evolution of homeostatic mechanism, and we're going to look at this diagram. So we're going to start right off the bat, and this one's a much less of a trick question than the previous two, but I want you to pause and think. Does the diagram on the left reflect an organism that demonstrates the phrase thermoregulation? So pause and think. All right, so immediately you should go, yes. I know what the word thermoregulation means, and that means temperature regulation. And I see that this is an organism that has the ability to warm its body by shivering and constricting its blood vessels based off of feedback from the environment. It also is an organism that can cool its body by sweating and dilating its blood vessels in response to environmental conditions. And therefore, this is an organism that is able to thermoregulate, either raise or lower its temperature based off of feedback from the environment, and then use that feedback to return back to a homeostatic state. This diagram very much could be a human. This is how human thermoregulation works. So in fact, yes, this is an example of an organism undergoing thermoregulation. So if we connect the differences in the environment with the evolution of homeostatic mechanisms, again, we could go back to that previous cladogram and ask the question of, well, how do these different organisms in these different groupings undergo thermoregulation? Do organisms like dogs and cats, for example, did they sweat? And the answer is, generally speaking, dogs and cats do not sweat, but they will pant in order to undergo thermoregulation. And we'll see other organisms will do other behaviors in order to achieve thermoregulation. And that sweating, which we see in here, this diaphoros, as that's shown in this diagram, is fairly unique within the animal kingdom, and that things like the vasodilation or vasoconstriction and shivering is actually pretty heavily conserved throughout the mammalian grouping. But sweating, as we know it, probably is not. All right, so I hope this was a nice review for you guys in terms of thermoregulation and a couple of our evolutionary mechanisms, and I'll talk to you all soon.